All right, so a number of years ago, I was involved in taking teams into Greece, where there was lots of Syrians coming in as refugees, and part of what our teams would do is play with children and do feeding programs and uh, these sorts of activities. And one of the things that I would say, because it was popular at the time, I had heard other people say, and I sort of adopted it, perhaps uncritically, was that one of the reasons we do all this is because Jesus was a refugee. Because if you read the Christmas stories, Jesus was a refugee, and I said this quite a lot at the time. However, over the years, as I've kind of gone back and read the Christmas accounts in Luke and in Matthew, and particularly the Matthew's gospel, where it actually records what people call refugee. As I've reread that, I've kind of rethought that. And nowadays, I'm not so sure I would say that anymore. I'm not so sure I would appeal to the Christmas story in any way as a sort of basis for anything to do with refugees at all. And there are three reasons for that: contextual reason, theological reason, and an exegetical reason. Let me explain what you mean. First of all, there's plenty of scripture that says that we should take care of immigrants and refugees, and there's a lot of good things in both the Old and the New Testament that if I were to teach on why we should take care of immigrants or help refugees, there's plenty of scripture I would use. I would not use the Christmas story, at least not anymore, because I don't believe you can make a really solid case that Jesus was in any sense of the term that where we tend to use the word refugee, that Jesus was a refugee in that sense. Jesus was only a refugee in only the broadest possible terms. Here, let me explain better on my contextually. Contextually, Jesus was perhaps about 2 years old at this time. It looked like they were no longer in the manger. Joseph's dad, he was not a poor man. He was a skilled laborer as opposed to an unskilled laborer. Many, Hebrew men at this time would have been unskilled field laborers. Fortunately, Jesus's adopted dad, Joseph, he had skills. He was a carpenter, and it seems like he was able to get work and steady enough income so that they could buy a house at this time. They were doing well, the Christmas family, as Jesus was approaching his toddler years. And that's when the Magi come in and they bring these gifts of gold and frankincense and silver. And it's at this time that Herod gets notified that someone who people are whispering might be the Messiah has been born. And so Herod looks to wipe this family out. So Joseph is warned in a dream to move over to Egypt, which is outside of Herod's jurisdiction. So Herod cannot get them. Now, in what sense is that like refugees today? Well, in the broadest possible sense that he felt threatened in one place, so he went to another place. Okay, well, I mean, in that broad sense, Jesus was a refugee several times in his life. There, you can think of the times when he was in Jerusalem and they were going to stone him to death, and says, so Jesus went out to the Jordan River. He went back up north to Galilee. There was a few times in his life where Jesus was facing hostile opposition, and so he moved from one place to another place so that he wouldn't get hurt. Okay, if that's what we mean by a refugee, then okay, Jesus was a refugee. However, that's usually not what most people use the term refugee. When people talk about refugee nowadays, usually they're meaning he left one nation, usually as part of a whole group. So there's thousands upon thousands of people leaving one place because of war or oppression, and this massive group is coming and seeking political asylum in another place. They get put on waiting lists. They have to fill out forms. There's immigration officials, all these sorts of things. Joseph and Mary didn't have to go through any of that. Joseph and Mary had money. They weren't broke. They had money, and they didn't have to pass through any immigration officials. No papers. They were all part of the Roman Empire. They didn't need to learn to speak a new language. Greek language was fine anywhere in the Roman Empire. Joseph moved shop from Bethlehem over to Egypt and continued to profit well as a carpenter and had these gifts that the Magi had given him. The family's experience would be so different from what we tend to think of when we use the term refugees today, that when people make a big deal and say Jesus' family was a refugee, first of all, Matthew doesn't use that term. You have to read that term into it and look at the experience and say, well, in a sense, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. you have to kind of insert that term in there, and you have to kind of use it in a way that people generally nowadays aren't using it. And you got to ask yourself, am I coming to this whole Jesus was a refugee thing in the Christmas story because that's the most obvious reading of the text? Or am I trying to insert a socio-political narrative, even if it's a good one? Even if it's a good one, even if you're all for Christians caring for refugees and immigration, which, like I said, other parts of the Bible support, and we should. But is that really what Matthew was writing about? Like, was Matthew writing his gospel? Did the reason he write chapter 2 of his gospel is the reason he inserted that little part about going to Egypt? Did he put it there in order to inspire us to care for refugees? No. I mean, you can clearly, in his own comments on it, that was not in his thinking. That was not in his mind. There are other parts of Scripture that do that. The Christmas story is not one of them. The other difference that I have with calling Jesus a refugee, it's not so much contextual, it's more theological. And that is when you say that Jesus is a refugee, you imply that there is some place that is not Jesus's home, or there's some place that does not belong to Jesus. Yes, Jesus was a human being. Yes, Jesus got tired and he got thirsty and he got hungry, but he was still the creator and sustainer of all things. And there's not one part of this whole earth that does not belong to Jesus. Okay, Jesus doesn't need to get permission from the Chinese to go and live in China. China is his, and the Chinese have to leave if they're on his land, so to speak. That's not the case for refugees. For refugees, like, for example, I'm natively American and my wife is Danish, and we have come to the UK and we're applying to become citizens. We're not citizens yet. We've lived here almost a long time, over a decade, still not citizens, but we're asking. And Britain has the right to say no. Like, it is within their legal rights to deny us citizenship and tell us to go home. They could do that, and they would be morally justified if they wanted to get rid of us and say, you immigrants, go home. They could tell that to me and my wife, and that would, however, when Jesus shows up, he's like, these islands, they're mine. I own them. That's why Jesus walked into the temple, and remember, he was kicking the stuff in the temple. If he had just been a normal human being, he would have been breaking the law. That would have been sin. But the temple was his. It was his temple. Solomon dedicated it to the Lord, and he was the Lord. So he could go into that temple, he could kick tables all over, and it not be sin for him. It would have been sin for me. It would be sin for you. By that temple, that was his. That was given to him. And the same way, the whole earth is his. And imply and say Jesus was a refugee when he went to Egypt. Again, they didn't have to cross any political boundaries. It was actually all part of the same nation. It's more like moving from California to Texas, which a lot of people are doing nowadays because of the failed policies of Californian politics. It's more like moving from one state to another than one nation to another. But even implying it, it's well, Israel is Jesus's, but Egypt isn't. No, Jesus owns the whole world. He is not a foreigner in the same sense that you or I would. Yes, in his humanity, yes, he would have experienced that, and he'd have had to learn about the culture there, yeah. But he is also God, and he has a moral right to be there in a way that you or I do not. And the last thing is not just contextual, but exegetical. And I think I kind of already referred to this. Is there anything there in chapter 2 of Matthew that gives us the impression, did Matthew write anything that makes us think that the reason I'm writing this Christmas story is to get you to think about refugees or immigrants? Well, no. His verse, he said the reason he put that little bit in Egypt there, he puts at the end, because out of Egypt I called my son. Now, I'm not going to unpack all that. It's a very complicated hermeneutic Matthew is appealing to. But Matthew is trying to identify the Messiah with ethnic Israel, that his love for ethnic Israel, that the ethnicity descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the people of Israel, the Jewish people, that, how God called them out of Egypt and gave them that land, that little piece of real estate in the Middle East. He's affirming his love for them in giving them that land. And he's saying that just as Israel came out of Egypt, so the Messiah had to come out of Egypt, because he is the fulfillment of Israel. He is the fulfillment of ethnic Israel. And, once again, that's quite a complicated concept. We could go back into Hosea, unpack. But that was what was on Matthew's mind. It had nothing to do with refugees, nothing to do with immigrants. Again, those themes are in the Bible. They're just in other places in the Bible. And so, whereas in previous years, or around Christmas time, I might have said something like, let's remember Christmas is about refugees, or Jesus's family was the refugees. I don't think I'll be saying that anymore, because contextually, theologically, exegetically, it is a stretch. It's a stretch. He is only a refugee in the sense that you or I would be refugee if we were kind of being persecuted in one area and we went down the road and set up shop there. So in a broad sense, maybe, but it's not what evokes in the mind nowadays. The fact is that today's refugees have a lot more difficult time and a lot harder time than Mary and Joseph would have moving from Bethlehem to Egypt. Comparatively, with their wealth, with Joseph's skills, with the lack of political barriers, it would have been a lot easier for Joseph and Mary than for most immigrants today. Joseph and Mary would have other challenges down the road, no doubt about it. But it's a bit disingenuous, and we're trying to. I think people, when I read the tweets and the social media posts of people, it's clear that there's a socio-political agenda. They're trying to really press into the Christmas narrative. That if you were to ask Matthew, why did you tell this story, would have been one of the furthest things from his mind. So no more. I'm off the Jesus was a refugee train. It's just not there in Matthew chapter 2.